The last human broadcast crackled through the ruined relay while a beam carved a trench through the city and my boots skidded on glass. And I remember thinking if this is the end of the world it should at least come with better music. Then I heard the child crying in the background of the transmission and I shut up, because jokes do not hold a candle to that sound when you are one of the last people who can still stand up and do something about it. They called it a status report, but it sounded like a farewell letter read by a voice that had forgotten how to hope. The message stuttered in and out over the shattered district, and every sentence rode on a storm of static. The galactic elites had taken the orbital ring by noon, the polar shields by dusk, the major resistance networks before midnight. Our cities did not burn so much as they buckled, glass and concrete turned soft as candle wax under weapons I could not even pronounce. The broadcast made it official. Surviving nodes were to shutter, scatter, burrow, call it living if you like. Keep the species going, said the voice. I checked the power pack on my rifle and wondered what the point of surviving was if it meant abandoning every promise we ever made to each other. The relay station used to run commuter adverts for weekend beaches and concert specials. Now it glowed with a sick green light and hummed like a hive. I had taken a graze along the ribs earlier and the plate under my jacket felt like it had a heartbeat of its own. My name is Jackson Reed, sergeant by habit more than by rank, because when your chain of command is rubble you keep the words that still sound like spine. I did a quick inventory. 1 rifle that needed coaxing, 3 magazines that had seen better days, a knife I had carried since training, a ration bar with the texture of regret, and a small bandage wrapped around a prayer I refused to say out loud. I rubbed the bandage with my thumb and pictured my sister in a school hallway on a Tuesday morning when the world still made ordinary sense. The bunker under the transit exchange still had a door that would open when I knocked with the right pattern. Someone inside swore, then somebody else started crying because that is what people do when the door finally opens and a familiar face stands there. Command was a loose word now, but Captain Vale wore it like a burden she would not put down. Her hair had gone shock white in the space of a week, and her eyes did the math of casualties while the rest of her pretended to be made of stone. She waved me in without ceremony. The room stank of damp concrete and hot wiring. A map floated on a cracked tablet that insisted on shutting itself off every time someone breathed near it. We were 12 by head count and 3 by fighting strength, and one of those 3 was held together with tape and stubbornness that looked a lot like denial. Vale pointed at the map, at a cluster of red symbols that lay over our district like a curse. The elites called their occupation process pacification, as if they were tucking us into bed. They seeded hunter towers at the edges of each zone and laced the air with drones that listened and sniffed and shared. If one drone heard you cough, the swarm would meet for coffee over your coordinates. The elites did not shout when they won. They simply turned the physics against you until resistance felt like pushing into a hurricane with a paper umbrella. We argued because there was nothing else left to do. Some wanted to break for the hills. Someone talked about an old launch site by the western desert, and a rumor of a shuttle that still knew how to fly. I heard the desperation in the idea, a reach for a sky that no longer belonged to us. I had watched the elites up close in the first weeks, when we still believed battles followed rules and glorious stands could be tallied like chapters in a book. They had eyes that were not eyes and armor that flowed when they walked, the color of ash stirred in water. Their language rolled like machinery and wind chimes, and sometimes it sounded like laughter. Their ships did not land so much as they decided to be somewhere. I had seen one cut a mountain in half, and the mountain did not even have the courtesy to make a proper noise about it. Yet there were patterns. Every sweep, every bombardment, every blockade ran through a heartbeat of coordination that felt like a conductor at the center of a silent orchestra. You sense these things when you have spent your life reading trouble. The broadcasts did not mention a center. That was not their job. A broadcast tells you what to fear. A Marine learns to look for where the fear begins. The argument in the bunker broke along the fault line that splits any family under siege. "Live to fight another day," said Vale. Her voice stayed steady, but her hands shook on the tabletop. "Every raid you lead brings their guns down on children. We cannot move fast enough." A young tech by the door kept biting his knuckle and staring at the floor like it might answer if he gazed hard enough. A medic with soot on her cheeks asked me if I had seen the schoolyard on 17th. I had. A crater that smelled like hot copper and chalk dust. My mouth went dry. The relay speaker still muttered its slow surrender in the corner. Survive. Scatter. Make your peace with the small life you can carry. I told them what I had seen in the patrol patterns, in the timing between aerial drags, in the way the hunter towers angled their dishes at odd hours like sunflowers chasing different stars. I said there is a place where orders become action, and if we rip out that place the orders will turn to noise. Vale stared at me with the kind of love that looks like fury. You want to take a handful of bullets and go break the spine of an empire. I shrugged because saying yes out loud would make it sound foolish. Then I ruined the performance by grinning. Not a handful, Captain. I have at least 3 handfuls. If you could roll your eyes into next week, she did it. But I saw hope flicker behind the exasperation, the kind that scares you because it might ask you to pay for it with everything you are. Someone in the corner muttered that this was treason against the plan being to hide and hope the storm forgets your address. I did not look at the speaker. I had learned the shape of that voice over the last months, sleek with resentment, always the first to count bodies and the last to carry a stretcher. I filed the sound away for later and told Vale what I needed. A climbing harness from the service shaft. 2 charges with clean timers. A mask from the chemical kit that would foul the elite's scent algorithms just long enough for me to pass a gate. A drone shell, even a broken one, to stay talking so I would not start thinking too hard. The medic pressed the kit into my hands with a small nod. The tech fetched the harness and tried to give me a good luck charm that used to hang from his sister's backpack. I told him to keep it, told him it worked better that way. The city looked different once I stepped behind the lines, not because the buildings had changed but because my pulse had. Streets that used to belong to people now belonged to shadows that moved with mechanical patience. I had fought in war zones before, but this was something else entirely. The elites had a way of turning every detail into intimidation. Street lamps glowed not with light but with a faint hum that drilled into the ear. Patrols moved in clockwork precision, their armor sliding across the road like sheets of liquid metal. Even the graffiti left by rebels on old walls seemed afraid to hold its colors. I pulled the mask higher on my face and told the drone shell bouncing against my hip that this was definitely the scenic tour. It did not laugh, but I imagined it did. If you want to stay sane in hostile territory, you give voices to things that cannot talk back. The first step of surviving behind enemy lines is remembering that the enemy thinks you are already dead. That is both curse and gift. The elites swept in waves, marking zones with their hunter towers and moving on, confident that nothing fragile could breathe under their net. What they forgot is that human stubbornness grows best where it is told not to. I crouched under the remains of a bakery window and watched a pair of elites float past, their armor glowing faintly green as if alive. Their weapons looked delicate, like instruments, but I had seen one turn an APC into puddled steel. I held my breath and counted heartbeats until they moved out of sight. When I finally let the air out, I told the drone buddy that they needed a new wardrobe because the green glow really did nothing for their figures. Humor is oxygen when silence tries to strangle you. Moving through the city was like threading a maze that rearranged itself every hour. The elites seeded drones into the air like pollen, and each one carried a different sensor, some for sound, some for heat, some for the trace chemicals human skin gives off when you sweat. The trick was knowing which pattern ruled the street at the moment you crossed it. I smeared more of the chemical paste Caliph had given me earlier over my forearms, the stuff that made your scent map red like burned rubber. She had said it was crude but effective. Crude is my kind of charm. A drone passed so close overhead that I could hear the delicate click of its wings adjusting. For a second I thought of swatting it down with the knife just to see what would happen, but then remembered the part about living long enough to matter. I stayed still, let it hum away, then moved again. It was in the service tunnels under the old metro line that I found something I did not expect. Rows of cages lit by stereo light, each holding a human slumped against the bars. Not prisoners in the way armies take prisoners, but specimens the way a laboratory keeps frogs. The elites were not feeding them properly. Their lips cracked, their eyes unfocused. The air smelled of antiseptic and despair. I clenched the knife so hard my knuckles groaned. I wanted to open every cage and run, but opening cages means alarms. Alarms mean towers. Towers mean no one survives. I whispered through the bars to the closest captive, a boy maybe 16. His eyes fluttered open and he looked at me as though I were another dream sent to torture him. I told him not to make a sound, told him I would be back. His hand weakly gripped my wrist before sliding down again. That moment tattooed itself into me. Whatever else happened, I had to make it back. Not for me. For them. Above ground, the world reeked of iron rain. I found an abandoned store and raided it for wires, batteries, and the small trinkets soldiers always know can turn into traps if you are desperate enough. A pair of elites moved through the square outside, their voices a murmur like sand pouring over stone. I cobbled together a tripwire with a charge so tiny it would do no more than blind them for a minute. When the first one crossed it, the explosion was hardly more than a flash. But that was enough. They stumbled and I slipped past on the far side, hugging the wall. I grinned behind the mask. Sometimes a pebble thrown at a giant is enough to get you where you need to go. Buddy tapped my leg like it approved. I told it we were a good team, me and the world's most sarcastic paperweight. Night in occupied territory feels different than true night. The stars do not matter when orbiting ships shed a pale haze over everything. The elites like to flood their zones with a steady twilight glow that stripped shadows of their honesty. I crept along rooftops, careful not to silhouette myself, and listened. Far below, human collaborators herded lines of survivors into processing stations. My teeth hurt from grinding. Every instinct screamed to jump down and start firing, but that would last all of 10 seconds before beams stitched me out of existence. Instead, I memorized faces, routes, times. Data is weaponry too, just slower to fire. I told myself there would be a reckoning. That promise kept my legs steady as I dropped to the next roof. It was while crossing the western quadrant that I first encountered Calith. I did not know her name yet. I only knew a shape moving where no elite should have been, smaller, cloaked, carrying a tablet, not a weapon. I raised my rifle and she raised her hand. Her voice was layered, mechanical and melodic at once, but the words came in human tongue. If you kill me, you will never learn how fragile they really are. That caught my attention like a nail through the boot. No elite ever wasted time learning human speech. I lowered the rifle, but not the suspicion. She introduced herself as a researcher, one who had seen rot at the heart of the Empire and wanted it burned out. I almost laughed because betrayal is a language every soldier understands. But then she showed me the data. Images of the command nexus, a core that sent signals to every tower and ship, a system without which the elites became little more than scattered predators. She said the weakness was real, but it required someone reckless enough to walk directly into the hive. She studied me as though deciding if I was that man. I told her she had terrible timing. I also told her I was listening. Trust does not come easy when the species across from you once split your battalion in half with a gesture. But Kayla spoke with a kind of clinical detachment that felt more honest than any human speech I had heard in weeks. She admitted her people had uplifted humanity long ago, shaping us into soldiers before discarding us. She admitted the Empire did not see us as anything but a failed experiment now cluttering space. I asked her why she wanted to help. She said corruption had strangled curiosity in her empire. They built only to control now. She wanted to remember what it was like to build for wonder. I looked at her two long fingers, her strange eyes, and wondered if maybe wonder is not species-specific. Against my better judgment, I chose to keep her alive. The university depot had a skeleton grin in the half-light, all arches and shattered glass, and the elites had draped it in humming fields that made the hair on my arms creep. Calith led me along a line of old lecture halls where chairs lay on their sides like toppled pawns, then down a stairwell that spiraled into a concrete throat. She moved like she had rehearsed this path 1,000 times, and maybe she had, on maps and in simulations and in quiet moments when treason was just a thought with no skin. I kept my hands away from the walls because they cracked with a faint frost that climbed toward my fingers like curious insects. But he bumped my calf and I told it to keep its sarcasm down, and Caliph glanced back at me with an expression that was not quite confusion and not quite amusement, which for her counted as a big laugh. The door at the bottom looked like a slab of night. Caliph knelt and slid a thin prism into a recessed slot. The slab drank the light, then sighed and opened. Inside, the air was cool, dry, untouched by the sour breath of occupation. A vault for ideas, she said, as if the words weighed something. I have seen a lot of rooms where people tried to control the future. Most smell like bravado. This one smelled like sterility and good intentions gone too far. Rows of translucent pylons rose from the floor, each pulsing with patient code. I followed Caliph to a console that floated like a leaf over still water. She touched it, and the pylons bloomed with images that hit me like a fist made of memories I did not know I had. The first image was a starfield with arcs traced between points, a web mapping centuries of expansion. Human ships moved along those arcs like fireflies. Our hulls were different then, slimmer, more nervous, as if built by hands that had not yet learned to be ashamed of wonder. Then came scenes of training camps not on Earth but on worlds with pale grass and skies the wrong color. Children ran obstacle courses under the gaze of instructors who were almost human and not at all human. Caliph did not narrate. She let the archive do its cruel work. It showed squads of humans in armor we had never invented, fighting under banners we never chose, dying with the same stubborn grit that had always been our only reliable export. Uplift, said a header across the flow of images, a calm word used to cover what was essentially conscription by miracle. I wanted to be sick, but there was nothing in my stomach but ration paste and hard truths. The archive did not hide the fallout. It showed cities on other worlds where human veterans drank in silence, where their children did not know which language to call home. It showed the moment the Empire turned away, funding cut, fleets recalled, a patron losing interest in its pet project. Humanity receded into the dark with a goodbye note that could have been written by a forgetful god. Caliph finally spoke. "You were made to be resilient," she said. The word felt like a compliment and an accusation jammed together. I asked her if any of this had mattered to the current regime, the ones cutting our mountains like cake. She said it mattered only in that we were known quantities. They assumed we would behave as we were designed. That is when a very old, very petty part of me decided I would spend the rest of my life proving them bad engineers. We did not come only for ghosts. Caliph pivoted the archive to a schematics cluster. The command nexus resolved out of abstract into bone and nerve. It was not a single building or server farm. It was a distributed mind, a lattice of entangled cores anchored by a beating heart aboard the capital warship I had seen moving overhead like a dark moon. She highlighted pathways between the Nexus and the Hunter Towers. Each tower received timing pulses without which its targeting degraded into delay. There was the gap, thin as a whisper. A cascading failure could be triggered if the anchor took a shock shaped exactly like a human arrhythmia. She explained the physics, and I spread my hands like a man holding back a herd. "Speak, soldier," I said. She did. The Nexus had been tuned, in part, against signaling templates modeled on early human neural patterns. It was elegant, cruel, and efficient. The Empire had built a mind taught to ignore our ghosts until one day a ghost walked through the door with the right key. We extracted what we needed, compressing data into a band I strapped under my armor. The vault lights dimmed as if exhausted by the confession. I told Caliph I owed her one, and she said debt was a human framing but that she would accept a promise of completion. I said she was getting both. Then the world upstairs changed pitch. You learned to hear it. The hum deepened, the way air changes before a storm. I lifted my rifle and Caliph froze like a statue listening for cracks. We moved toward the exit and found our path held by a trio of figures in patchwork armor with antique rifles and eyes that had not slept. Resistance, by the way they stood. For a second my chest filled with the relief of family. Then I saw the man at the back, shoulders too still, mouth a little too flat, a voice I remembered from the bunker, the one that had bled poison into every plan. Riggs stepped forward with his palms up as if he had brought peace in a sack. It would be funny if it were not so predictable. He told the others I had gone rogue, that I was consorting with the enemy, bringing ruin down on the heads they were trying to keep beneath notice. He demanded we surrender the data so proper channels could review it. There are no proper channels when your city is a bruise, but fear loves a uniform even when the uniform is imaginary. I said we were walking out and anyone who wanted to help was welcome. Riggs smiled without showing teeth. He had something hidden near his collar, a sliver of metal flush with skin. I did not need Caliph to tell me it was a beacon. The towers would already be turning their dishes. We were a rabbit staring at the sky, waiting for the hawk. Caliph did something subtle with her wrist, and the corridor lights flickered. The three at the front flinched, their courage cracking at the edges the way it does when you realize your arguments will not stop a beam. Rig kept his eyes on me. He said he had made arrangements, that some of us would be spared once the occupation settled, that the Empire rewarded the reasonable. Reasonable is a word you can use to sell any sin if you practice enough. I stepped in and tore the beacon free. His hand went to his throat, and he backed up. For a heartbeat I could have put a round through him. Instead I threw the beacon down the hall. But he rolled after it like a dog after a stick, and the doors at the far end snapped open just in time to reveal a wedge of elite wardens sliding into the corridor. The fight was a mess of light and sound. The wardens moved with that smug inevitability, beams lancing out in thin lines that chewed wall and railing into glitter. I went low and dirty, learned motions powered by muscle memory and desperation. Caliph cast a wedge of distortion in the air and two beams slithered away like snakes, frying only the ceiling. One of the resistance fighters took a hit to the shoulder and spun into Caliph's device with a scream that died into a grunt as she dragged him aside. Rig vanished the way cowards do, sideways into a door that had been locked until the moment it mattered. I filed that detail for whatever day I got to close a ledger. It started small, like a rumor carried by wind across ruins, the story of a soldier who kept slipping through the cracks of an empire that insisted it had no cracks. At first it was just me and Caliph, moving like ghosts through the districts, planting sabotage where the elites least expected it. A supply convoy vanished into an ambush of collapsing bridges. A Hunter Tower's sensors began spinning in blind circles because its pulse core had been swapped with a portable heater wired by my clumsy hands. Kayla said my methods were crude but effective, and I told her that was also how my grandmother described her cooking. The laugh she gave me then was quiet, like it escaped by accident. Buddy recorded it with a flicker of his broken lens, and I swore to save that sound for the days ahead when silence tried to choke us. The resistance cells that still breathed in the tunnels heard whispers of what we were doing. At first they did not believe. One Marine and a defector alien making a fool of the Empire sounded like a drunken story told over stolen rations. But then I began to see marks scratched into walls, symbols of thanks, notes left in chalk pointing toward caches of food, even a crude drawing of my battered rifle under the words "still fighting." I tried not to let it swell my chest too much, but the truth is hope feels like oxygen when you have been breathing ash. Caliph warned me that attention meant the elites would sharpen their retaliation. She was right. The very next week an entire settlement went dark, its people scattered like paper in a storm. The survivors who stumbled into our path carried eyes that asked whether our victories were worth the graves they had left behind. That question followed me like a shadow I could not step away from. One night we sat near a fire no bigger than a candle, its light hidden by a tent of scavenged metal. A boy no older than 12 stared at me across the flames, chewing on a strip of bark because that was all he had. His sister sat beside him, eyes glassy from crying too long. He asked me why I kept fighting when every strike brought down worse punishments. He wanted to know if heroes were worth the cost. I wanted to give him an answer that would make the ache vanish from his face. Instead I told him the truth. I said I was no hero, just too stubborn to stop. Sometimes stubbornness buys time, and time is a currency that might one day add up to freedom. He nodded slowly, as if testing the words against the hunger in his stomach. Later that night I heard him whisper to his sister that if one man could keep going maybe they could too. The ache inside me twisted but I clung to it, because pain can be a compass pointing to what matters. Caliph grew more open as the weeks stretched. She began sharing fragments of her own doubts, how she had once stood in gleaming halls where curiosity was worshipped and questions were sacred. Then power shifted, curiosity was declared wasteful, and every experiment bent toward control. She said she had stayed too long, hoping the rot would heal itself, until she realized it had devoured everything. I told her she sounded like an old soldier who had lost his faith in command, and she almost smiled again. We were different creatures, but in the quiet between raids, we found a rhythm. She talked about equations, I talked about mud and grit, and somewhere in between a strange trust settled. I still kept one eye open when I slept, but that is habit more than suspicion. A soldier who does not sleep with one eye open does not sleep for long. The Empire did not take our defiance lightly. They began broadcasting counter-stories, describing me as a rogue mercenary, a butcher of civilians, a traitor to my own kind. Their propaganda painted Caliph as a deceiver leading me by the nose into ruin. They did not realize that propaganda works poorly when the people already see their children dragged into cages. Still, the lies burned, because some of our own resistance began to question whether following me would doom them faster. A cell leader confronted me in a flooded underpass, demanding to know what proof I had that my plan could succeed. I held up the polymer key Caliph had given me, explained about the Nexus, about the anchor, about the chance to break the Empire's coordination. He studied the strip as though it might dissolve in his hand. Then he shoved it back at me and said, "Fine, but if you fail, every grave from here to the horizon will belong to your name." I carried those words like lead in my pack. Raids turned bloodier as our legend grew. We struck a depot in the southern industrial zone, freeing dozens of captives, but the elites retaliated by glassing 2 entire blocks. The survivors staggered through the rubble, coughing blood and dust, and one woman clutched at me with broken fingers. She screamed that my arrogance had brought the fire on them. Her words carved me hollow. That night, I sat in silence while Caliph recalibrated one of her devices. She glanced at me and said humans seem to believe that suffering is currency they can spend for meaning. I told her sometimes that was all we had left. She considered that for a long time and did not argue further. Despite the cost, more fighters joined. They called themselves shadows, ghosts, remnants, whatever word gave shape to defiance. I trained them the way Marines are trained, fast and dirty, because polish does not matter when you are learning to stay alive. We hit targets with precision, never the same place twice, always disappearing before the towers could lock. Each strike was a cut on the Empire's arrogance, and arrogance bleeds more than flesh. Rumors spread beyond the city, across continents, even off-world. Smugglers whispered of a lone Marine who had become a symbol, and symbols are harder to kill than soldiers. I began to fear my own shadow, because when stories grow taller than the man who cast them, the fall can crush everything beneath. The moment came when Caliph told me the small cuts were no longer enough. She had tracked the Nexus pulse and identified a window, narrow as a breath, when the dread sovereign would pass closest to its anchor core. A strike then, with the key, could unspool the coordination. The plan was suicide by design. Infiltrate the Empire's flagship, reach the heart, plant the disruption. I stared at her maps spread on the floor of a ruined library, the pages damp and curling. The plan had elegance in its cruelty. She said if we succeeded, the Empire would falter long enough for humanity to rise. If we failed, the story would end with us. I looked at her and tried a smile. So, I said, suicide mission? My specialty. She did not smile back. She said the odds were fractional but non-zero. I told her I had lived my entire life inside that exact ratio. That night, before the mission solidified into destiny, I walked through the camp of shadows. Some slept, some sharpened blades, some whispered prayers to gods they had not spoken to in years. A young fighter asked me if we were really going to take the fight to the Sovereign. I told him yes. His eyes shone with a hope so sharp it hurt. Another asked if I was afraid. I answered honestly. Terrified. But fear is proof you still value what you stand to lose. They nodded like that was wisdom, though it felt like nothing more than confession. When I lay down at last, Buddy hummed faintly by my side, and I wondered if it understood that this path was lined with graves but still the only road worth walking. The dread sovereign hung above the clouds like a wound in the sky, a ship so massive it looked less like it was built and more like the universe had grown it in a moment of malice. Every city below it cast a long shadow shaped by its orbit, a reminder that the Empire did not simply occupy our world, it owned the daylight. We had stolen a transport during the last raid, an armored hauler meant for prisoners. Its hull still smelled of fear. Kalith rewired its signature so the Sovereign would read it as legitimate cargo, but even she admitted the disguise would hold only long enough for us to slip into their belly. After that, every second was borrowed time. The fighters who came with us sat in silence on the cold benches, eyes staring past me toward futures they did not dare to picture. I could feel their fear in the air, sharp and electric, and it mirrored my own. Fear is good. Fear keeps your hands steady when arrogance would make them shake. The approach was silent except for the hum of engines. The Sovereign grew larger until the viewports were filled with nothing but black armor veined with faint green light. It was less like docking with a ship and more like being swallowed whole. The clamps gripped us with a sound like bones breaking, and the doors hissed open onto a bay lined with towers of alien machinery. Elites moved in slow arcs across the hangar, their motions patient, predatory. For a heartbeat I thought the disguise had failed and we would be cut down where we stood, but the guards only swept past us, their eyes unreadable behind armor that pulsed with its own heartbeat. Kalith gave me the slightest nod. The game had begun. We moved as though we belonged, unloading false crates and pushing them across the hangar. Each crate contained charges wired to detonate on a silent timer, meant to ripple across the bay just when we needed the distraction most. The fighters sweated under their disguises, flinching each time an elite brushed past. I kept my rifle slung, fingers itching, every instinct screaming to open fire and damn the plan. Discipline is a strange thing. You learn it so you can disobey it only when it truly matters. We passed through the bay and into the service shafts that ran like veins through the Sovereign. The air inside was colder than I expected, recycled too many times, smelling faintly of metal and chemical rain. Kalith guided us with certainty, her hands brushing the walls as though they whispered directions only she could hear. The first alarm came sooner than I hoped. A warden patrol rounded the shaft bend and halted, their sensor arrays twitching. For a frozen moment the two sides stared at each other. Then the wardens surged forward. We fired in unison, beams and bullets carving the corridor into smoke and fire. One fighter went down with a scream as a lance of green heat cut through his leg. Another hurled himself into the fray with a blade scavenged from an elite corpse, slashing until the weapon glowed red and split apart in his hands. The fight was brutal and short. We left the wardens in broken heaps behind us, but the noise had already summoned attention. Kayla snapped at me that we were ahead of schedule now, which was her calm way of saying the whole ship was about to wake up angry. We planted the first charges in a reactor conduit. The glow of alien energy pulsed like veins under translucent armor. The fighter who rigged the bombs grinned at me with teeth too white for this dirty war, and said if he died at least he would go out lighting up the prettiest fireworks in the galaxy. I told him to keep breathing because I had plans for him after. The grin stayed but his hands trembled as he set the final timer. We pressed forward, every corridor feeling more like a throat closing around us. Sirens began to sound, not blaring but low and resonant, a vibration that crawled through your bones until your body became the alarm itself. When we reached the inner sanctum, resistance thickened. The elites had gathered their warlords here, towering figures draped in shifting armor that shimmered like oil. They moved with grace, their weapons slicing the air as if they were conducting a symphony of destruction. The battle that erupted was chaos given form. Fighters darted between beams, firing in desperate bursts. Kalith unleashed devices that warped the senses, turning corridors into mazes that confused even the elites. I found myself face to face with a warlord taller than I could reach with my rifle, but his strike slammed into my chest plate, sending me crashing into a wall so hard I saw stars. He raised his weapon for the killing blow. I laughed through blood in my teeth because sometimes laughter is the only thing that belongs to you. I jammed my knife into the joint under his ribs and twisted until the armor cracked like frozen water. He toppled with a sound that was almost a sigh. I staggered back, coughing blood, but alive. It was during that madness that betrayal returned. Riggs stepped from a shadowed alcove, not with a rifle but with a command token glowing in his palm. The fighters gasped as he shouted that he had made a deal, that the Empire had promised survival for those who cooperated. His voice carried the desperate certainty of a man who had already sold his soul and wanted others to join the auction. The warlords shifted around him, granting him a corridor of protection. I raised my rifle, but Kalith moved first. With a calmness that froze the air, she hurled a shard of light that lanced straight through Riggs' chest. He stared at her in shock, dropped the token, and fell without a word. Her eyes met mine. "No one who chooses them can be allowed to live," she said, her voice flat. For the first time I believed without question that her loyalty was real. She had crossed her own kind once. Now she crossed mine, to keep me alive. The fight dragged us into the heart chamber, a space the size of a cathedral. At its center pulsed the anchor, a sphere of shifting energy held in suspension by arcs of green lightning. The sight made my skin crawl, as though my body recognized something my mind could not. Kalith pressed the key into my palm. "The moment you touch it to the anchor, the Nexus will falter." I asked her how long before the Empire recovers. She said long enough if humanity is ready. "That is a scholar's answer," I told her, "not a soldier's." She tilted her head, almost smiling. "Then fight like both," she said. We carved a path to the anchor under fire. Fighters fell beside me, their bodies collapsing into silence, their sacrifice buying each step forward. I reached the dais, my chest heaving, blood slick on my ribs. The anchor pulsed, humming with a rhythm too steady to be natural. I held the key, a sliver of polymer that suddenly felt heavier than the world. Behind me the battle raged. Kalith screamed a warning as a warlord charged. I spun, slammed the key against the anchor, and in that moment the world convulsed. The hum faltered. The lights spasmed. Across the ship, alarms rose into a keening wail. I felt it like a heartbeat tripping on itself. The anchor hesitated. And hesitation is death in war. The ship groaned like a lung full of smoke, and every corridor threw sparks as if the Sovereign itself hated the silence between explosions. We ran with the others through air that tasted like metal, following Buddy's uncertain light, while alarms pressed on our bones. The anchor beat erratic behind us, its once perfect pulse now a drunk drum stumbling toward collapse. For a few crooked minutes I believed we had done enough, and that leaving would be victory. Then the floor bucked, a wall split, and a blast wave tossed us like dice. I skidded across plating hot enough to blister, and slammed into a railing that bent under my weight. Kalith dragged me up with a strength that did not match her frame. Her face held that patient calm she wore like armor, but I had learned her tells. The cords at her neck were tight as wires. She had already run the calculations and did not like the answer. We reached a junction where 3 corridors met like broken fingers. The evac shaft we needed was beyond a bulkhead now fused shut by heat. Kalith pushed a device against the seam and watched numbers march across its face. She shook her head once. The system had sealed to contain the cascade. The only other path curled back toward the core chamber and a maintenance loop that fed the anchor its timing field. She said the words I had been waiting to hear since I first saw the schematic. "The anchor will heal if we leave it like this. The Nexus will rephase. The hesitation we gave it will harden into a lesson against us. Someone has to hold the fracture open, push it into failure." She met my eyes and for the first time let the fear show. That someone needs the right rhythm. The key needs a living carrier inside the loop. She did not have to say the rest. Her body would not read as valid to the anchor's ancient biases. Buddy did not have a heartbeat. Half our fighters were dead or bleeding. The other half looked like they had already given what they could. I touched the band against my skin, felt the thin sliver of polymer warm to my palm. The plan had always carried this shadow. We named it contingency in the maps so we did not have to say sacrifice. I heard Vale's voice in my memory asking for something we could believe in. I heard the quiet, angry promise of the boy in the cage. I heard my sister laughing on a clean Tuesday morning. I told Kalith I would go. She said no too fast and too flat, as if speed and tone could make time obey. We argued because humans argue at the edge of goodbye. She said my presence had become a symbol and symbols are more useful alive. I said a symbol that does not risk the cost goes stale and mean. She said there might be another way, and I told her she had already looked for it while I was up to my elbows in angry warlords. Her mouth made a shape that could have been a curse or a prayer. The fighters listened without interrupting, because they understood what we did not want to say. At last she did the strangest thing I had seen her do. She reached for my hand, not to test a pulse or adjust a bandage, but simply to hold it. Her fingers were wrong in all the ways that made them hers, long and cool and precise. You will not be alone, she said very quietly. The loop will take your rhythm and multiply it. The moment you begin, you will be everywhere in the network. That is a scientist's way of telling a dying man that his last heartbeat will be large enough to shake stars. I told her to get the others to the shuttle deck, to take Buddy, to find the cages under the city and tear them open. I told her to tell Vale that the math had come due, and we paid with interest. I tried a joke and botched it on purpose so she could fix it in her head and locate the laugh she was statistically unlikely to give. She squeezed my hand once and let go. For people like us, that counts as a confession. She gave me 3 devices without names and one last sliver of truth. The loop will resist you. It will offer you the relief of stopping. Do not believe its promise. I told her stubbornness was the first thing I ever learned to hold. Then I turned for the maintenance ring, and the fighters cleared a path with the kind of silence that honors only one thing. The loop chamber felt like the inside of a throat. Rings of dark alloy rotated around a core where light crawled in patterns too pretty for a weapon. Panels waited like open palms. I stepped into a harness that kissed my ribs with cold metal and slid the key into the cradle. The system folded around me with an intimacy that would have made me flinch on any other day. The first pulse hit like a shove. My heart stuttered against it, then found the beat. Data and pain flowed together until the difference stopped meaning anything. I felt the lattice of the Nexus as a web strung across the planet and beyond, each strand a command, each knot a tower, each tower an eye. My own pulse bled into the structure as a mistake the machine could not correct quickly enough. It tried. It threw up rations of repair code, it rerouted, it appealed to rules written when my species still thought the night sky was a ceiling. I held my breath, and then I held my breathlessness, and then I held the fact that I was still able to hold anything. The ship fought me like a living thing. It offered me sleep as a gift. It told me the fight would continue without me. It promised me the child in the broadcast would be fine if I just let go. Machines do not lie in words, but they lie in the way they arrange your choices. I grated out a laugh and said out loud that I could not hear it over the terrible music. Then I thought of the actual child, and of the boy in the cage, and of the woman who blamed me in the ruins. I thought of the soldier whose grin had been too white for this war. I thought of Caliph hating the rot in her halls of curiosity. I thought of Vale bending over a map that would not hold still. I breathed through the pain in steady increments, and fed the loop the one thing it had been trained to discount. I fed it human refusal. Somewhere far away and very near, charges timed by a grin began to go off, blooming like flowers of force. The fighters hit their way through the recovering wardens with the ferocity of people who had run out of lesser options. The evac deck shivered under impact as the hangars tore open. Caliph guided them like a conductor whose orchestra had learned to improvise. I sensed her by the absence of panic in the patterns near the deck. She was sending people home with those small sharp orders of hers that sounded like decisions but were actually gifts. Buddy zipped alongside her at a stubborn wobble that would have made me smile if smiling had not taken a level of spare energy I had already donated to the cause. On the ground, the towers stuttered. Their dishes turned and lost their alignment, then found it, and then lost it again. Timing pulses turned to static. Drones fought their own heuristics, and the skies above the city filled with stalled wings. In tunnels and basements and bricked-up storefronts, resistance cells felt the pressure lift from their chests like a door finally opening. Vale stepped into a street that had forgotten how to hold daylight, and raised a hand that still knew how to command. She led charges not with speeches but with directions, one block at a time, one mistake forgiven, one success multiplied. Prison pens opened with the clatter of keys that had never been forged. The boy who had gripped my wrist blinked against real air and did not ask permission to run.